All right, so we're going to talk about identity. And joining me is going to be Ahron from HSBC, Matt from Decentral Games. We've got Emma from CAF and Women in Identity, and Nilesh from WNS. Really excited to have you all on stage. Hello.
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 Thank you. Some applause. Thanks, Brian.
That was my mum.
Yes.
That's great. Okay, let's do introductions so that people can get a feel for who we are and why we're here. Ahron, you want to kick it off?
Yes, so Ahron Geminder, I head up a team in HSBC looking at third-party services, how we really work with more external vendors to bring some cool tech into the bank, and particularly look after the digital identity platform.
I'm Matt Howells-Barby. I'm at Decentral Games. I spent best part of the past 10 years in the software as a service space and then jumped all the way into the Web3 world. So we're a GameFi project that's built gaming experiences inside the metaverse. Couldn't be more buzzwordy if I tried. But so we're a completely decentralized organization. And yeah, I'm excited to be chatting about digital identity.
My name's Emma Lindley. I am co-founder of Women in Identity, which is a non-profit organisation trying to get more diversity in the digital identity industry. I've worked in the industry for about 20 years, and I'm currently managing director for an organisation called CAF, which is a Brazilian identity company.
Okay. Hi, everyone. I'm Nilesh Pal, and I lead the overall banking and financial services solutions and strategy globally for WNS, and I work with clients globally to understand their requirements and craft suitable solutions, and bulk of our clients currently are in the fintech space, and look forward to this conversation.
Yeah, it's great. It's great to have such a diverse panel.
Yeah.
So first question is just, I think, setting the scene. We all know identity is important. I think we can all intuitively grasp that, and I think we'll sort of dig into not only why it's important, but why it's challenging. But let's kick it off with what's broken about it right now, and kind of like what needs to be fixed. Why would we be talking about identity at a Web3 meets TradFi conference?
So I can kick off and challenge what's not broken about it, if I'm being honest. I think the challenge we've got, and I can look at it from a large bank perspective, is we still have one fundamental question we have to answer for anyone who wants to come and use our products, which is, who are you? How do we know that you are who you say you are? And how do we figure that out in a way that is robust? How we figure that out in a way that is dependable, trustable? And we're still trying to figure that out. And we're still, I think, far too heavily dependent upon a piece of paper or a plastic card that's given to you by a government institution. And I think that's something we've got to try and figure out and fix.
And just to add to, I think, basically, I think the speed of the way the KYC as a process is changing with the current dynamics happening. So people are looking for quick kind of KYC rather than the traditional paper-based or the traditional thing. And of course, in the light of the pandemic, we've seen a drastic change wherein the digital KYC is now becoming an in thing. But the drawbacks of digital KYC in terms of the data privacy concerns continue to affect banks. And that's where I think the new ways using the Web3 and the entire technology, digital identity, is what we would be looking forward to kind of going into as well, like using the cryptocurrency and the blockchain technology into this.
I think one of the key issues that we have is that the data that we rely on, such as name and address and date of birth and identity documents that we use to prove our identity, much of that data has been breached or stolen. And one of the component parts that kind of makes that worse is the fact that a lot of databases are centralized, and that makes them a honeypot of data. If we take, CAF, the company that I work for, if we take Brazil, for example, in 2021, their entire CPF, the CPF is the identity number in Brazil, the entire database was breached and stolen. And that makes the baseline for what you're trying to prove identity, it just makes it so much harder. So, you know, Brazil's moved to biometrics quicker than anywhere else. But then one of the biggest players in identity in Brazil is creating a central database of biometrics. So we're just doing the same thing again and creating the same problem.
So if I can replay that, the equivalent of the social security number
Yep.
for the entire country of Brazil
Yes, correct.
was compromised.
Was compromised, yeah.
The whole database.
Sounds
Whole
bad.
database.
And now they've said, okay, we'll just do it differently. We'll do eyeballs instead. And they're putting everybody's eyeballs in the same sort of system.
The largest provider in Brazil is a centralized database of facial biometrics. And you know, we're working on doing something decentralized because you know, we kind of think that that's an issue. But yeah.
I think the number of countries that have horror stories of centralized databases that have been compromised, I think almost every country in the world that has tried this has had some issue with it. I mean, we've seen 1 billion records that were compromised because one guy in a police station in Shanghai did not lock a terminal properly, and people gained access to that entire database. And the problem that we've got, particularly when we start to look at identity information and when we start going down the companies that are, for example, capturing customers' ID documents and storing them long-term and not storing them properly, you then have, when that database is compromised, that is your facial biometric that is compromised. And unless you have a very good plastic surgeon, that's it. Once that's out there, once that is compromised, there's no coming back from it. So we go into a very, very dark place of how you're able to effectively maintain your own identity when your face is compromised.
Yeah, so it'd be hard enough to walk back the violation of a number that's printed. I mean, theoretically, I could get a new social security number. I don't know if they do that, but I can't get a new face.
Yeah.
So I guess I might be jumping ahead a little bit here, but I do need some help understanding, so why is decentralized better?
Well, I think it's worth also mentioning, right, when it comes to decentralized and Web3, the stakes get a lot higher. Right? You know, the concept of identity that's come with the early proliferation, at least, of Web3, we've moved from the idea of identity kind of centering around the individual, and whether it be biometric data, whether it be through like identity password kind of documents, you've now got the Web3 wallet, the crypto wallet being the core identifier. And this is like your entire financial history publicly available, and now bringing this online. I think we see with Web3, one of the great things about decentralized technology is, and one of the things that is one of its huge benefits being talked about, is ownership. Ownership and custody coming back to the individual, having this Web3 wallet become kind of your digital identity passport. And then you compare it to the traditional kind of centralized systems where you're seeing regular breaches of data on almost like a daily basis into the hundreds of thousands or millions, if not more, of records every day. You know, Web3, I'm someone that is a big advocate of Web3. I'm deeply involved in Web3. And it still comes with its huge challenges. I think so far this year, we've seen around $4 billion worth of exploits in decentralized finance so far. So, you know, there's still challenges along the way that come with this. And I think that bringing all of digital identity on and into Web3 has to be done right. I don't think just the technology is the single silver bullet solution to all of this. Is it better than having a centralized system? Almost certainly, but I think the architecture and design of that's incredibly important.
I'd love to ask another follow-on question there, just because if are the $4 billion of exploits, are those happening as one-offs, or are they lumps of people? And kind of I don't know if this is a corollary, but another question that jumped to mind is, how many people can really be trusted with their private keys? Because I know I shouldn't be trusted with my private keys.
Can anyone be trusted with their private keys? I think that, you know, there's a huge education that comes with this, and I think somewhat unfortunately, you know, we went through the introduction of decentralized, like not just finances and identity, but, you know, having custodianship of your own assets is such a foreign concept to pretty much anyone. And we've went through and this horrendous user experience right now in just simply setting up a wallet, understanding like how you need to own your own private keys, be your own bank. And now the kind of solution is, okay, how do we actually kind of end up doing more of having centralized custodians that manage this kind of for you, and it's just to get people on board. I think when we solve this issue, we're going to get much more people on board. But yeah, being able to be trusted, what happens when you die, and where do your private keys go? Like all of these like situations, there's not a lot of good infrastructure and education as well around all of this for regular people, and even like very advanced people in the space.
Yeah, jump in. I feel like you're going to nail this one.
Maybe, I don't know. We'll see. I think the decentralization of data is important to help with data breaches and central honeypots and things like that. And I kind of think about, the move towards decentralization of identity. We've got kind of like full self-sovereign identity. You're in charge of your own keys here. And we've got where we are today, which is big central honeypots of data that are open to breach. I think the reality of it is, and I've done a lot of work with women in identity, looking at how people can actually, human beings, because we're talking about human beings here, can manage their own identities, understand identity, can they access identity, do they have the latest smartphone? And I think a lot of the kind of real self-sovereign identity relies on a really deep understanding of technology. It relies on having the latest smartphone. It relies on a whole bunch of things that not all of humanity have. So I think there is a midpoint with, reducing the issues around central honeypots of data and decentralizing that data, but actually still having things like trusted, intermediaries, third parties, like banks, sat here with who you might go, I would trust to keep my private keys, with my bank, So I think there's a midway point that's probably a bit more practical and pragmatic, that we could land identity, which will solve some of the issues that we've got, but are not going to leave a whole bunch of humanity behind.
I think the other challenge we've got is the technology that we use. We talk about real people, and we talk about the average person on the street, and the challenge we've got is the terminology we're using in the technology space at the moment around decentralized identity is what's also causing problems in the adoption of the technology. So I mean, we spoke often about the fact that, we talk about things like blockchain. And for the average person on the street, blockchain equals crypto. Crypto equals scary and risky, which therefore means blockchain equals risky. So we then go and say, we're going to do, decentralized identity and things like, using blockchain technology. And people go, ooh, no, not for me. No, thank you. And that starts to propagate that problem that will always hold the average person on the street away from doing something like this. So selling the benefits of this also becomes quite tricky. And let's be honest, for the average person out there, they're going, well, I'm in control of my own identity. I've got a book that lets me travel, and that's what I use to prove my identity, and I'm in control of who gets to see it. So it's almost, if we go right back to where we are there, to where we want to get of that equivalent in a digital space. The problem is we've gone down the path of taking that book, putting it into a central database, and that's where it's gone wrong. So how do we get to that point where you can have, for example, your own passport, your own driving license, your own form of ID that's in a digital format but under your own control? That's the perfect state we need to try and get to.
I think with that as well, like one thing that is obviously a huge frustration, I'm sure, for any companies building and requiring identity in the space, but also for individuals, is just the lack of interoperability. And I think one of the things that what we want Web3 to be able to provide is a common standard that can be very interoperable, but without creating kind of just more centralized, honeypots of data. The thing that I do think, there's a lot of really interesting, still very early technology, things like zero-knowledge proofs that can enable individuals to hold all of the aspects of their identity in a decentralized identity format and only release small fragments, pieces of it to trusted parties and have complete control and ownership to deliver that and verify aspects of it, whether that be driving license details or another piece, your date of birth, whatever it is, to another trusted party in a very private way. I think, though, getting to a point of a common standard is definitely one of the big challenges in all of this that it presents.
And just to add, I think what I've been also, and to be honest, I've been reading about it, is the ENS kind of a thing, where Ethereum kind of thing based, we are setting up like the name.cb.id kind of concept. So that way, each individual can create that individual identity through a blockchain service provider and kind of ensure that that's what's being used for all identity purposes. So that becomes his or her own identity rather than like the 42-digit kind of stuff. You can have it in a very simple fashion. So that's, I think it's something which is coming up as well.
Yeah, so every individual becomes his or her own website.
Yes.
Right, it's that 42-character identifier that can be reduced to Brustkern.eth as an example.
That's
And then if we have the appropriate controls over that, where we can reassign it in case of a one-off hack, is that the idea?
Yeah.
That's what that's what I've been reading. Basically, that it's like when we grew up saving passwords, then we moved to use Google kind of as a login straight away,
right.
And then we now moving into something like this with the ENS kind of concept, which will basically help get away with passwords and kind of do a seamless exercise. But at the same time, from a central security perspective, the points which we discussed, I think that's also important in terms of how to make sure that the decentralized elements are saved. And that's where the individual is responsible for creating his or her own ENS kind of thing, and then making sure where it is saved, protected.
But that brings me full circle back to that question of should I be trusted with my private keys? And in a sense, it's great so in this version of the world, we would have everyone's got their own, like, a single password to their one identifying piece that gets them onto their wallet, allows them to go transact. It's like a master password. And if I get hacked, bummer for me.
Yeah.
But for the rest of the world, they're safe. But it's still a big bummer for me, right? Because I lose everything. And in the world of Web3, I could sign something that inadvertently just is like the underlying code in it says, by signing this smart contract, I'm giving the other party all of my tokens. So it doesn't feel like that sells. Like that, how do I pitch that to the average consumer that says, you're in charge of everything, there is no custodian, there is no safety of the bank. Good luck.
Becoming the central point of failure is scary and very foreign to most people. And I think that largely this should move away from being like a security concern into a user experience problem, which it largely is. I think that some of the technology that we have right now, like wallets still, for all of the cash that's being pumped into them, are still incredibly poor user experiences for individuals. And I think that I think when we get to the widespread use of digital identity through blockchain, I think the notion that we will all kind of have our private keys written down somewhere will be a ridiculous idea in the future. I don't think that is going to be the way that we look at this. I think we're just in a very early stage of this technology. And I think to a lot of the points that have been made so far, when a lot of the kind of ideas around, like self-sovereign identity and like the early stages of kind of crypto largely being led by a big push of libertarianism, it's went to kind of the most extreme level and then bringing people back in. I don't think we get to a world where everyone looks after their private key, and that's how we look after things. Is that a net positive for the world in that you are the central point of failure versus Meta and others? Like, yeah, probably. But is it an acceptable user experience to the average user? Almost certainly not. And I think that's the balance that we need to strike.
I think the challenge we've also got, people today have been talking about things like regulations and the role that regulators play in the space. And what we need to remember is that they are the ones who are ultimately going to have to be convinced by this. And let's remind ourselves, the regulators exist in a way to protect everyone in this room. You go and you make, a somewhat, what could be silly mistake that to other people might seem very, very obvious, but to you felt very genuine at the time. And you, for somehow, some reason, have got yourself, scammed into giving away, for example, your bank account details to somebody. And that has resulted in your life savings disappearing. The first thing you do is you'll call the bank and go, well, help. And if the bank, for some reason, says no, the next step you go to is the regulator going, help. And if they say no, then what? Then there's no point in having a regulator in the first place. So a lot of that has to play into it as well. And I describe to people all the time that the best way to see a regulator is imagine the complexities of a large bank combined with the complexities of government. And that kind of gives you a place to where the regulators are. Understaffed, under-resourced, probably underappreciated, and everyone is moving so fast in comparison to them that they are now struggling to keep up, and they're just going to do what they do best, which is don't trust it, don't bother, don't go any further, and they'll hold back a lot, and hold back a lot of progress as well. So a lot of what we have to do, a lot of our responsibility from a technology perspective is take them on the ride with us. Explain to them where this will help, explain to them how this will help. And put ourselves out there to be completely investigated by the regulator. Let them dig into this with a microscope and go, how do I get to the point of going, yes, I can trust this? And the problem is, I think right now, I don't think we're there yet with where the technology is.
And there is lots of good work being done, from a kind of regulatory and kind of national perspective. Also, if we look at the European perspective, so such as EIDAS, which is the kind of European framework for identity. Now they have this year published their view on self-sovereign identity and digital wallets, and that's the way that the EU market is working. In the UK, they've got the government digital identity and trust framework. Again, they've pointed to that self-sovereign identity being a way in which you could solve the problems. But it takes a long time, right? And it's going to require, to your point, regulatory changes. It's going to require the regulators to come on board. And then it's going to require organizations that rely on those identities, the compliance departments in those organizations, to accept it as well.
So I'd love to take this in a couple of different directions. We've got audience questions that are popping up. Thank you. Keep them coming. QR code. I want to just touch on what you said, Ahron, because I have great empathy for regulators, especially regulators in other countries. So the FCA, I have this love affair with the FCA. I idealize them. I idolize them. But that's because I have the SEC in my home country. So, point taken. One of the things I wanted to touch on is the solutions that are on the table that you're seeing now that you're excited about. ZK proofs have been mentioned. I know there's others out there. So it'd be kind of interesting to hear about technologies that you think we might be hearing about so that our community can say, oh yeah, I remember, that rings a bell. The ZK proof thing, I should be paying attention to that. So that's perhaps we can dip there and then pull from some audience questions. Is that fair?
Yeah, I think there's, certainly speaking in like the Web3 space, there's a lot of interesting stuff happening with identity as a whole. I mean, you have this huge undercurrent that's come in the wider like crypto space, especially in the past 3 to 4 years, of anonymity, and how do you deal with like digital identity online when there's a huge amount of anonymity in Web3. I'm in a Web3 company, and when I joined, a good portion of the team that I moved into were pseudonymous, and it was the most bizarre experience. Our director of operations, I knew him for 4 months as Spicy Prawn. This was slightly different to what I was used to in a public SaaS company. So, and I think what we're starting to see is now a lot of Web3 native like identity platforms. Like Civic is a great example of like a Web3 identity platform that has been around since I think early 2017, trying to build this like central like identity platform. And I think the big buzz in Web3 is also solving the like messaging and communication kind of problem of like the Web3 wallet not just being about identity, but also is this going to replace the email inbox eventually and be like the central hub? So there's like a lot in there. Also, one of the things that plagues Web3 is the fact that a lot of great projects often release a token and then things get sidetracked by making token go up versus making this thing actually work. So there's a lot happening on that side, but I think all of this, again, is solving one piece of the puzzle, which is the tech. I think the regulation piece is like the whole other side of things that needs to follow suit with it.
Yeah, some other standards that I'd probably point to are the W3C standards, verifiable credentials, as well as the ZKPs. And then organisations that I think have done some really interesting work in this space, pioneering work in this space, is Evonym. They've recently been acquired by Avast, so they've been kind of around for a long while, sort of driving the decentralisation message. We're obviously doing some interesting work at CAF. Trying to think of other interesting companies. Miko is another one. They've done a lot of work around kind of the wallet space, particularly around, to your point, Matt, the way in which you can get users to adopt it. So a lot around that kind of UX piece, rather than really focusing on the technology, because in my opinion, the technology piece is not the hard part to solve. Yeah. Getting people to understand this, getting people to use it, and getting organizations to adopt it, that's the harder part, and it's nothing to do with technology.
Great, let's move into audience questions. We've got the most upvoted. Dan asked this question: why don't regulated banks see digital identity as the perfect premium API to offer? Ahron?
Good question. And the interesting thing is...
Sounds like you've just become a profit center.
The weird thing is, the conversations we have internally around this are frequent and often. And I normally don't get invited to these conversations anymore because I tend to be the person in the room, me and the guys that I work with tend to be the people in the room that are going, what about liability? And no one can answer the big liability question for me right now. So we've got a scenario where we can verify a customer's identity. Great, we're quite happy with that. It's working really, really well. But the method we use might not suit another bank. So then what happens there? Or what happens if we acquire a customer through open banking, for example, where they were verified by another bank? And one of the interesting challenges within HSBC, we operate in over 60 countries around the world. So we have the joy of working with the local regulator in every one of them. And what you then get is, and one of our unique selling points is, you as a customer in the UK, let's say, for example, you're going to move to the US, we can have a full bank account ready for you by the time you arrive. You can have everything, literally, the day before you leave, someone from the bank will deliver your bank card, all the details you need for you to function in your new country. Great. Now, we've done that through an interbank onboarding process. But what happens if you start in the UK, where you came in through a journey where maybe you just weren't verified as well as we would have liked, or maybe the verification process had a bit of a problem on the day you happen to onboard. And we then have to follow kind of this weird cookie crumb trail all the way back to, actually, this customer who's now jumped to 3 different countries and has got bank accounts everywhere. Actually, their initial onboarding was not done properly. And we're now liable to 3 different global regulators, or 3 different local regulators, our own global regulators, and it just becomes a bit of a mess. So the challenge we're trying to figure out now is, can we, as a group of, even just a group of UK banks, figure out a way to verify a digital identity that can answer the liability question? And then absolutely, that is 100% a premium API we would want to offer.
And when you say a group of UK banks, you're talking about HSBC and other of your competitors?
As our competitors,
okay.
Absolutely.
Interesting.
Yeah. If we can figure, we're seeing in other countries where this is working very well, is where banks have got together to figure this out. So we know, for example, in the Nordics, it's working very well. We know in Canada, it's starting to work quite well. But it's figuring out the liability question that keeps holding us back.
Okay. All right. Next question is, why should our identity be provided by and authenticated by our government, or why should it not? It's not a taboo topic. Let's dive right in. I mean, it's Big Brother, right?
Yeah.
Is that the big question?
You've seen utilities being formed through the years, like across governments. Singapore tried it. I think Norway has been on the last one to try now as well. We've seen some activity in Middle East as well. Interestingly, in Middle East, in UAE particularly, we are seeing a blockchain-based KYC utility being thought through. It's still not up, but that's something which they are going that path. And some of the conversations we are having right now is something which they are also contemplating to look at an entirely blockchain-based KYC program, which will help all the member kind of banks to kind of digitize and make it into an individual identity for each of their customers and make sure that they're, through a single kind of click, it'll be able to do the identity verification pretty quickly. Otherwise, the KYC utility programs across a lot of countries have not actually reaped the results, some of which Mark spoke about, the reasons for those, that it's still not foolproof enough. But in contrast, we've seen in capital markets world, the single utility thing is working pretty fine, because in capital markets, there have been a lot of entities which have gone, like if you want to open a simple, like a mutual fund account for yourself, just go ahead, give your identity into one single database, and it works pretty smoothly. If I talk about India, we have a central database running for identity, and it's working very smoothly. Yes, it is always at the risk of that central leakage, but then, yeah, it's working smoothly there. But in the Web3 world, we're yet to see what the governments are doing about it. The closest, as I mentioned, UAE is going that path.
Can I just add to that in the government? I was going to say, I mean, you need to, in order to have the proof of an identity, you need to have an authoritative source of that identity. So, and the reason why governments seem to be the authoritative source is because people have to go through a process to enrol to get that identity, and that process is seen as being robust. Now, could other organisations be an authoritative source? Probably. It doesn't have to be government. I still think there is a place for government in the identity ecosystem. I think they play an important part, and I've been really privileged to be to see lots of user testing where I've actually seen people trying to prove their identity in the context of trying to prove their identity with government. And what surprised me was that a lot of people do still trust government. They actually think that, and I'm going to caveat this because this was in the UK and it was 3 years ago. So we might do something that might be a different result now. But it surprised me because a lot of people just went, it's government. I trust government. They know this stuff about me. So I think we can't downplay the power of government in this ecosystem. But I think they play a part. I don't think they need to be the wholesome part, and I don't think they need to be the controller of people's identities, and I think that's different.
It can transition. Go ahead, please.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think you've also got this additional narrative, right, where if people are trusting governments a bit more, especially on the authentication side, if there's something that's been happening over the past at least half decade, if not decade, is people trusting large tech companies and large kind of banks, other financial institutions, much less. And I think this is kind of coming to the fore. There needs to be a place around authentication. I think was it Estonia that trialed a blockchain-based identity a few years ago? I think they did small trials. I think in the US they've done blockchain-based voting in certain states. So it's this is starting to happen. I think the authentication piece is the key challenge, right? It's we can put data on chain. And you can verify that the data is there, it hasn't been tampered with, but you still need to prove that the data in its essence is actually true. And someone or an entity of some sort has to verify that. So I think, yeah, it is a challenge one, because I think you've got the other piece just around discrimination that can come from having a centralized entity and owning identity data as well.
I'll just jump into the next question, which is a little bit more technical on how do these proofs work? So if a person owns all their identity and financial data, how can we ensure that they're providing a full indication of themselves, whether that's positive or could be viewed negatively?
Well, I think certainly on most like blockchains, like if we take like major public blockchains like Ethereum, for example, what's on the public ledger is on the public ledger, and you can't really escape that. I think the main challenge here is when we start to get into identity and putting like more kind of off-chain data on-chain, date of birth, identity records, like visuals, biometrics, things like that. They do need to be verified, and I think we're going to have entities that manage that process and put it on chain. The key thing here is that while they own that data, it's not something that they can just go in and change and tweak. It's going to be written in predefined smart contracts. Like you'll see a change history. Even now with decentralized finance, you don't need a credit history to go in and put down collateral and borrow today, right? Like anyone can do that. So I think we're already starting to see that, and I think that is a positive. And there are much more positives in it than negatives, in my opinion.
I'm thinking in my mind about like the shift between the authorities about sort of like the government seems to be the ultimate arbiter of who we are right now because of birth certificates. If we go back a couple hundred years, and probably only a couple hundred years, it would be the church. The parish priest would be the arbiter of whether or not I was baptized in the church and therefore I exist, right? So like, that's kind of an interesting multi-hundred-year process, but like, maybe it should rest with a neutral third party that doesn't have an ulterior motive, that is not big tech, is not necessarily government, but then what is it, who is it, and does it live on the blockchain? Is it, so
we should have church on the blockchain.
I've been approached.
The quote.
This idea is not new.
I think the caveat there is what you've just said is the crux of it, which is does not have an ulterior motive.
Right.
And I think you're never going to be in a position where there is a position of authority that won't ever be tempted or compromised. Yeah. I mean, we look at, there's one question in there where they talk about, synthetic ID issues. And we deal every day now where, countries are sanctioned. And you've got people who are high-ranking government officials in said sanctioned countries that just get a new ID. I've been added to a sanctions list, great. I go down to the office, they give me another ID, and I'm, great, no longer on the sanctions list, happy days. How do we start figuring that out? That then adds further complexity as well.
I mean, honestly, I think that's where not being able to change your face actually starts to become a real positive.
Yeah.
It's a really wild world, and I hope our community has appreciation for the challenges. Again, going back to what Mauricio and Peter said this morning, we have a lot of work to do. We're dealing with some really new technologies, and we're also facing a collision between not just financial worlds, but real issues of what does it mean to be Bo Brustkern? Like, who is that person? And can I prove it across borders instantaneously, easily, and just enough information so that you feel okay serving me a pint because I am over 21 years old if I'm in the US, or over 18 if I'm here, or over 12 if I'm in Mexico. But I think that's a challenge before us. Fascinating discussion. Thank you all for sharing your wisdom. And don't forget your reward is after the next session, we all get to have wine for dinner. So
That's great.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Thanks. Thank you.